Hey Apes Peeps, this is your intro to Unit 7A, Aquatic Ecosystems and Biodiversity. And in this screencast, we're going to be covering marine environments. So, 71% of the Earth is covered with water. Most of that is salt water, 97%, which leaves us about 3% that's freshwater. Of that freshwater here, you see this amount freshwater here, most of that, almost 80%, is in ice caps and glaciers. Some of it is in groundwater, and then you have a super small amount in surface water. Of that surface water, most of it is in lakes. Then you have soil moisture, atmospheric water vapor, rivers, and then water in organisms. Your aquatic life zones are saltwater life zones and freshwater life zones. Saltwater life zones we call marine. Okay, when you take marine biology, marine science, you're not studying rivers and lakes and streams, you're studying the ocean and ecosystems and coral reefs. In general, there are three different kind of ways that we classify organisms that live in the ocean. Nectonic are strong swimmers, your fish, your turtle, your whales. Benthic organisms live on the bottom, and then your plankton kind of like float around, or they can swim just a little bit. And of those plankton, you have phytoplankton and zooplankton. Phyto, like your phytoremediation, like your photosynthesis, those are your plant plankton. Most of your plankton are primary producers that start your aquatic food webs. And then you have your zooplankton, your animal plankton. These are single cell organisms to larger invertebrates like jellyfish. And then where things actually live in the ocean depends on a couple different factors. So your temperature, dissolved oxygen, and availability of food. Okay. Also availability of light and nutrients. Okay. If I'm a phytoplankton, I need to live somewhere where there's going to be light. So I'm not going to live in the deep ocean because I can't survive there because there's no light for photosynthesis. Greatest biodiversity exists in coral reefs, estuaries, with a mixing of two freshwater and saltwater comes together. And then the deep ocean floor has a lot more biodiversity than they used to think. Okay? And then biodiversity is also higher near the coast and the surface because that's usually where the food sources are. And you have runoff from land that put nutrients into the water, and you have upwelling and stuff, and you have a lot of these kind of like blank areas in the middle of the open ocean. We have several different biomes that exist in water. Open ocean, kelp forests, coral reefs. Okay. So your open ocean is the area past your continental shelf. Ocean functions as a huge carbon sink, and we extract a lot of oil and natural gas from these areas. Kelp forests are huge strands of big, thick algae, and they provide their own habitat. They are kind of the forests of the ocean. You have they protect shorelines from erosion, and a lot of these algae are eaten and used in a lot of different products. And then we have coral reefs, which everybody absolutely loves. A lot of issues with coral reefs. We're going to talk a lot about them. A lot of really great environmental benefits of coral reefs as well as economic benefits. Your intertidal zone are these rocky shorelines that have different zones. So in between your high tide and your low tide, there are going to be different zones there. So animals have to be adapted for being wet some of the time and being dry some of the time. And then my personal favorite, salt marshes. These are our things. At temperate latitudes, you have grasses, shrubs, lots of primary productivity. This is the whole meadowlands where Jimmy Hoffa is buried. We've used them as dumping grounds, and they are absolutely amazing ecosystems. Further south, instead of salt marshes, they have mangrove forests. So these are your tropical and subtropical latitudes. So you have mangrove trees with these big prop roots and these amazing ecosystems. They provide some of the same ecosystem services that salt marshes do, and they are also phenomenal ecosystems. And then your estuaries are basically where your ocean mixes with your fresh water, usually at the mouth of a river, and this has some really great functions as well, like marshes and mangrove forests. So just want to show you guys some pictures. This is a kelp forest, and you can see these giant bull kelp, and they attach onto a rocky surface, and they provide this amazing habitat, and they're these really amazing ecosystems. Then we have coral reefs. These are some pictures from about 2008, and what I was doing was some coral reef work in Thailand, and what we were doing is we were taking healthy pieces of coral. I know it's really hard to see in this picture, but we were taking healthy corals and putting them in this big blue bin, and then we would take them to a reef that was pretty damaged. And you can see these metal rods are called biorock. And what it does is there's a small current of electricity that runs through this, nothing that you can feel. And because of that electricity, what happens is the calcium and the magnesium precipitate out of the water faster than they would under normal conditions. So what this does is this prompts the coral to actually grow, seeing that the coral skeleton is made up of calcium carbonate. So what we were doing is we were taking these little broken sections of healthy coral and putting them onto a section of coral that was gross and disgusting. You can see here. And this is a piece of coral that had been planted about 6 months before. And once you provide that habitat, the animals start coming back in. So this is just a picture of some coral bleaching. You can see this here is healthy coral, whereas this part around here has been most likely in this case suffocated by sediment. Because you can see there's a lot of sand on top of it, and what that does is it suffocates the coral, and the polyps come out, and then you get coral bleaching. Okay. Here's a diagram of the intertidal zone. So the area down here is usually submerged, then you have a splash zone, and up here you have organisms that need to be able to go into a shell, close up really tight, or be really tolerant of dry conditions. Here are some intertidal zone pictures. This is probably from the supertidal zone up top. There are some periwinkle snails, and during the dry times, what they do is they go really tight into their shells, and then when the tide comes back up, then they can come back out of their shells. Salt marshes. I love salt marshes. This is where I work for Fish and Wildlife. I will not bore you with these, but they're amazing, amazing ecosystems. They're really great for kayaking too. Seagrass beds are kind of like coral reefs up north, but a lot of biodiversity, lots of places to hide. And then mangrove forests. These are very, very cool. You see the big prop roots, a whole bunch of different types of mangrove trees, and in general, a very, very cool environment. So going back to wetlands, there are a lot of different functions that wetlands have. So how do the following function as a wetland? So if you look on your sheet, these are there as well. The first one is a sponge. Okay, so a marsh or a wetland can function as a sponge because what it does is it literally absorbs excess water, especially during times of flood. These wetlands can absorb a huge amount of water, which is why destroying wetlands is such a huge deal, especially with global climate change and rising sea levels. So we take out our sponges and we get lots more flooding. So take some time now or later and fill in 2 through 7 with what you think they function as. As far as coral reefs go, they have very specific parameters that they form in. Clear, warm, coastal waters, tropics and subtropics. It can't be too cold, it can't be too warm, they can't be covered with too much water, it can't be too murky, and they're very easily damaged, they grow very slowly, and they've been harmed from coastal pollution and global warming and a lot of different factors. Huge amounts of ecological and economic services, but they're declining because of our coastal development, pollution, overfishing, and increasing ocean acidity. And we're going to go over this a little bit later on. There are 3 different types of coral reefs, and these aren't really important. I'm not going to test you guys on these, but it's important, I think, not necessarily important to know, but I think it's interesting to know. Your fringing reef comes directly off of land. It's attached to your continent, that's it. Whereas your atoll, you have basically a collapsed volcano, or you have an all coral island, and there's a ring, and here's a big lagoon. Then you have a barrier reef, which separates the lagoon from the ocean. So the Great Barrier Reef is a type of barrier reef. In the ocean, we have a couple different zones. You have your euphotic, sometimes called the photic zone, which is the lighted upper area. You have low nutrient levels, but you have high dissolved oxygen because you have a lot of organisms creating oxygen through photosynthesis. Then you have your baffle zone, your kind of middle murky zone. And then your abyssal zone is your dark lower zone. It's very cold. There's very little dissolved oxygen because you don't have photosynthesis, but there are lots and lots of nutrients down there. So here's just a diagram for you guys, and you have that in your notes as well. Human impact. We're losing coastal areas to development. We all want to live at the beach. We fill these places in for agriculture. There's a huge amount of beach erosion because of rising sea levels, because of climate change, increased storms. We have runoff of point and non-point source pollution. And you have all of those different things, like you saw in your reading for HIPCO, that are impacting these coastal environments. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is the Chesapeake Bay, which is an estuary in trouble. It was an estuary in trouble, and it still is. We're going to do a case study on this later on in the week, but it's the largest estuary in the U.S. It's been highly polluted by point and non-point sources of pollution. You have high levels of nitrates and phosphates causing eutrophication, which we're going to go over later. And basically, you have oysters, which were a keystone species there, are greatly reduced, so your filtering capacity now goes down. And in 1983, there was this program called the Chesapeake Bay Program, and they were going to do all of these things, and it was going to be amazing. And they did all of these things, and none of them really worked. So 25 years later, $6 billion later, basically the water quality is still very poor, and the program hasn't met, almost any of its goals. So the Chesapeake Bay is still an estuary in trouble.